guys, it's Alex, and today I'm here with a book review for Scythe by Neal Shusterman. This is a young adult dystopian novel set in a future where humanity has cured death. But overpopulation is still a problem as people are stuck on Earth, so specific people have been designated as scythes, whose job it is to kill other people in order to keep population down. Scythes have a specific set of rules they must follow, and quotas they have to fill for how many people they kill, but they are largely unchecked and just kill where it is necessary. I read this for the Literary Alliance book club over on Facebook, and this is not a book I would have picked up for myself. I've heard a lot about it as it's made the rounds on BookTube over the course of the last several years, and it was never something that appealed to me. It didn't sound very good, and I heard some negative reviews that were just talking about it in a way that made it seem like I probably would not love this book as much as a lot of people seem to. So, I do want to say that caveat up front. This was not a book I went into really expecting to love it. I expected to feel about it the same way I did about Vicious, in that it wasn't my kind of book, but it was well done. I did not feel that way about Scythe. I thought Scythe was very poorly done, and I strongly disliked this book. I gave it 2 stars, and it's quite possibly a book that could make my worst list of the year, because I was really frustrated by this. My biggest problem, more than anything else, was the world. I didn't buy into the world at all. Nothing about the world felt right. It didn't feel true or authentic. It felt like wherever I looked, there were more questions. I had more questions that couldn't be answered. Just the existence of those questions made the world not make sense. There were too many holes in it. Like, I was given the premise for a lot of things in the world, but not much actual in-depth world building. And so many things just didn't make sense. For instance, what happened to religion? They kind of briefly hit on religion at a point, but not much. And considering they conquered death, I feel like a lot of the very prominent religions today would have a lot of things to say about that. So I expected it to be dealt with in some way, even in a very minor way, and it wasn't. They also talk about how back in the age of mortality, there were so many more emotions, and people felt things so much more strongly. But the thing is, people still die in this book. Like, scythes kill people. It's not like death never happens. It happens less and in a very different way, but death is still an active part of their lives. And I actually looked it up. In this book, at one point, Neal Shusterman says that scythes kill 5 million people per year. I don't remember where he said this, but I swear it was somewhere in the book. I wrote it down because I wanted to look up how many people die in our world today. And today, per year, 55 million people die. So that's 5 million versus 55 million, which is a very big difference. I'm not arguing that. But I felt like for me, it wasn't enough of a difference where you could differentiate it between talking about the age of mortality versus we have conquered death. If 5 million people a year are still dying, that doesn't really feel to me like they've conquered death. And that really didn't make sense. It didn't make sense that they were talking in a way like no one ever died, when clearly in this book, people die on a fairly regular basis. Less often, but still often enough that it felt like fearing scythes was a normal part of most people's lives. That whole premise of the world did not make sense to me. Also, the world is run by this benevolent supercomputer that man has created. It's an AI that has gotten much more powerful and much more intelligent than any human could be, and they've kind of given over leadership to it. There are no governments, there are no presidents or prime ministers or anything like that. The Thunderhead, the supercomputer, runs everything, and it is a perfect benevolent god. It is painfully fair and always accurate, always perfect, always knows the right thing to do. Which, okay, like, I can buy into that. Like, if you have this impartial supercomputer that doesn't want to take over the world, it just wants to make humans a better world, that's so much better than an inherently corrupt politician that will always be selfish to some degree. That's so much better. I can agree with that. But then, why would you put the power of death and deciding who would die in the hands of these people who are inherently corrupt? People have the power over who dies, whereas the Thunderhead controls everything else, and everything else is perfect. The only corruption is in with the scythes, which just doesn't make sense to me. Like, I don't understand why they didn't just give the power of death to the computer in the first place. This isn't a spoiler, by the way. This is like the premise of the book. I had a lot of issues with just like the premise of the world that did not make sense to me. The excuse given was kind of that death is a human thing and it's up to humans to decide who lives or dies. But that just kind of felt like a meaningless excuse. Like, it didn't really make sense. It felt like one of those things where he was like, oh, I need a reason for this to happen in my book, so I'm just gonna say some crap about how death is part of humanity, so only humanity can decide, and not the perfect supercomputer that literally would be the best thing to decide. So that didn't make sense to me, and it kind of frustrated me. And because there are no governments, the supercomputer runs everything. It didn't make sense that there were different regions with their borders and different laws. This was kind of dealt with at a point later in the book where it just didn't make sense. If the supercomputer is running everything, so there are no like regional governments, then why are there borders? Why are there different laws for different regions? Like, that just inherently does not make sense if the supercomputer is running everything instead of individual governments. No one cares about learning anything anymore because apparently there's nothing new to learn. Because, again, the supercomputer knows everything and is better than any human. But overpopulation is still a concern. Like, yes, the supercomputer is creating solutions to the problems of overpopulation, but they still have to kill 5 million people a year, which is a fair number of people. So I feel like if humans were also helping with that problem, it would go better. They also say that space exploration was a failure, so they're not going to try that again. But clearly, if you failed at space exploration and colonizing other planets so those people didn't have to die, then there's something to learn. You can learn that. You can learn how to explore space in a safe way so people don't die. And there's clearly nothing new to learn. It's an aspect of the book because this is not the age of mortality anymore, and Neal Shusterman says so. I don't know. It didn't make sense to me. At one point, Rowan, who is one of the main characters who has been chosen to be an apprentice to a Scythe to eventually become a Scythe, he's in a helicopter with a bunch of people he doesn't like, and he finds himself wishing that the helicopter would crash so they would all die. And then he thinks, oh, but wait, if the helicopter crashed, we'd all just be revived, so it doesn't matter anyway. But if he'd grown up in this world where he'd only ever known immortality, like people don't just die accidentally, he wouldn't have had that thought to begin with. Like, there were many small things like that thrown in that were just like, this doesn't make sense for the world. That was very annoying to read, as well as the bigger issues. And example of another bigger issue, at one point a character is accused of murder. In this world, where there is no crime, it has been established that there is no crime. Maybe some very petty misdemeanors, but no actual crimes. Certainly no murder in hundreds of years. A character is accused of murder, and people are shocked and horrified, but pretty much about to the same degree that people today would be shocked and horrified, because murder is a shocking and horrifying crime. They're not shook to their core that everything they thought about their society is a lie. The reaction should have been so much bigger to accusing someone of murder. Just being shocked and horrified is not enough, because it was very much a normalized today reaction, like, oh my god, I can't believe, like, this teacher killed a student. You know, that's absolutely horrifying, but not because there is no murder in our society, it's just a horrifying situation. The reaction in this should have been so much more. If they're in a society that hasn't seen a murder in hundreds of years, like, everyone should just be absolutely flabbergasted, don't know what to do, I've lost entire faith in the system. It didn't make sense that they kind of just took it in stride and were like, okay, we can open up a prison that's been closed down for centuries. We can open it up just for this one person. That makes sense. It's all fine. Like, it wouldn't be fine. The society has no crime, and suddenly there's a crime, which means something has gone wrong, and people should be incredibly disturbed and terrified about that. But they weren't, and it was just like a very dampened reaction that really bothered me and just like did not make sense in the context of the book. So that was about 10 minutes on why the world didn't make sense to me. Not every example I had, but like a lot of the major ones that I felt were good illustrations of why it didn't make sense to me. So getting into some of my other issues, because it wasn't just the world, that was just kind of the big one. So much of the plot just seemed random. Like, things would happen with no or very little build-up. They'd just be thrown in there like, here's a dramatic moment, and it came out of nowhere. It didn't make sense within the story. There was no foreshadowing, no build-up, no arc to the story. It would just like be going along fine and then just jump to somewhere new. It didn't make sense. and then be resolved entirely too easily. And sometimes it would be resolved off screen, like entirely off screen. It'd be like, okay, well, 20 pages have passed, and like that whole problem that was like a huge major problem, the climax of the book, it's been solved now, it's fine. And it was really frustrating to read. It felt like nothing in this book mattered or meant anything because it would just be thrown in out of nowhere and then just solved out of nowhere as well. It was jarring and weird, and not because these things were like a plot twist or a surprise, it was just because they were random, like pointlessly random. Like it was a first draft and he just came up with a new idea for something to happen and didn't go back and make sure that that idea worked within the arc of the story and that it fit. It was a very frustrating reading experience. The problems that were thrown at the characters just seemed so easy to solve through like obvious loopholes. The problems were caused by scythes who were hundreds of years old, who'd been doing this for centuries, literal centuries, and they were just like foiled by a couple of teenage kids who were just like straight teenagers, not like they lived for centuries and were teenagers again. Like, no, they'd been alive for 17 years and just completely found loopholes in all the laws that were created by centuries old people. Like, it did not make sense. And the final point I had, which is probably the most minor point I've made, because mostly it was just like the world. I hated the world. I hated the way he wrote the world and it didn't make sense. But the last small point, it started randomly switching point of view later in the book. Most of the book was told from the point of view of Rowan and Citra, who were the two people apprenticed to be scythes. They were both like 17 and learning to become new scythes, which was fine to a degree. Like, just hearing from both of them, I kind of didn't like reading from them very much. Citra I was fine with. I found Rowan very annoying and did not care about his sections. But it started switching point of view to other people later on, because it got to the point where the story could not be told from Citra and Rowan alone. It needed other perspectives because they didn't have the whole story and it wouldn't be complete without other people. And the fact that he didn't find a way around that and he just started randomly including other people later on felt really lazy to me, just like super lazy writing. I hate when authors do that later on in the book because they realize they don't have enough information. The main characters don't have enough information to tell the whole story. So they just start adding in other random people. I find it really lazy and frustrating. Like, as a writer and as a reader, it feels cheap and it makes me unhappy to read. And it was just like, I don't know, the final nail in the coffin for this book, maybe. I was already irritated and done by that point, but it was frustrating to read. This whole book was frustrating to read. It took me 3 weeks, and like, this is not a tiny book, but it's a fairly quick YA dystopian. And it took me 3 weeks to read because I never wanted to pick it up, because every page was a frustrating slog to get through, and I really disliked it. Like, it was honestly not that far off from being a 1 star for me. And I don't understand why people love it so much. Like, I guess if you can just accept the world at face value, it would be a lot better. But even then, like, I didn't think the writing was that great. I didn't think the story arc was any good. I didn't like the characters. There was just nothing in this book. And I swear to God, for the first 30 pages, I thought this might be a 4 stars. And I can't for the life of me remember why, because this was a pretty awful reading experience for me. Like, even when it comes to picking up hyped books that really aren't my thing, that I don't expect to love, this was awful. This was down there with Girls of Paper and Fire, which I just thought was awful and terrible reading experience. Like, I really dislike this book. I obviously won't be continuing on the series. I really don't care. I don't care to know anything that happens to these characters in the future because their actions at the end frustrated me. Their actions at the beginning frustrated me a little bit, but like, there was a level of they're dumb kids who don't know any better at the beginning, and then at the end, they were making decisions that were supposed to be like, wow, really touching and powerful and moving, when they were really just still acting like dumb kids who hadn't learned anything. And it was frustrating. That was my overall thought of this book. It was very frustrating to read. I don't want to talk anyone out of reading it because, like, apparently a lot of people really love it. I'm in the minority, so like, if it sounds interesting to you or you're planning to read it, don't let me talk you out of it, because I'm just the random bitter person on the internet who hated this book. But there's so much love for it that there's honestly probably a solid chance you'll love it too and not have any idea what I'm talking about here. Let me know down below if you've read Scythe and what you thought of it if you had, and if you really liked Scythe, like if you're one of those people who loved it and it's like one of your favorite books, I would really love for you to respond to some of my negative thoughts because, like, I'm really curious why people like it because it's just one of those, like, I can't fathom enjoying this book because I didn't. But I would love a perspective of someone who has, who's like straight responding to things that I thought were very negative. It would be interesting to hear about that because I do know I'm in the very small minority on this one. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see y'all again soon.